Today, in this explainer, we're diving into one of the most insane survival stories in all of human history. We're talking about the tale of the Umayyad military machine. It's the story of a dynasty that was literally annihilated, only to rise from its own ashes on the complete opposite side of the known world. And they didn't just survive, they built a military apparatus so unbelievably powerful, it eventually burned its own empire to the ground. Which brings us to a massive, mind-bending historical question. Can an empire actually survive its own execution? I mean, how does a ruling dynasty, after being systematically hunted down and slaughtered in the Middle East, manage to relocate entirely across the Mediterranean and build a military state that was even more formidable than the one they just lost? Well, the answer to that seemingly impossible question comes down to the number one. Out of an entire sprawling royal family, there was exactly one survivor. The phoenix of our story is Prince Abd ar-Rahman, the single Umayyad royal who actually managed to escape total extermination. And honestly, the sheer unlikelihood of his survival cannot be overstated. With assassins constantly on his heels, he fled for his absolute life, hiding out in obscurity for nearly 5 agonizing years before finally finding a way to rebuild his family's legacy in Spain. But to truly understand the epic scale of his new empire, we first need to understand the old one.
Let's get right into Section 1, Birth of the War Machine, the Syrian origins of the Umayyad military.
So, the core of this early military was built on something called the Ajnad. These were specific Syrian military districts. Now, this wasn't just a regular standing army. It was a profoundly revolutionary social and military system for its time. The Arab tribes living in these districts were completely intertwined with the local society. They didn't just deploy from some faraway capital, They lived on the land, they collected local taxes to fund themselves, and they were primarily responsible for directly defending their own home regions. This system stretched across some key real estate: Damascus, Hims, Palestine, Jordan, and eventually Kinnisreen. It was heavily provincial and fiercely defensively oriented. These districts were engineered specifically to hold the crucial northern frontier against the massive Byzantine Empire, all while providing a deeply loyal, localized base of power for the Umayyad caliphs ruling out of Damascus. Ultimately, this early setup created what historians call a jihad state. Now, think of this early Umayyad state like a shark. A shark has to keep swimming forward, right? Or it drowns. Well, the Umayyad military machine relied entirely on mass mobilization and constant, aggressive annual raids and campaigns. If the wars ever stopped, the influx of wealth and plunder dried up, the tribal soldiers got restless, and the entire state apparatus would just suffocate and collapse. It was a society engineered from the ground up for relentless expansion. Moving right along to Section 2, Rebirth in Al-Andalus, the flight of the sole survivor. The timeline here is just breathtaking. In 750 AD, the Umayyads in Syria are virtually wiped off the map by the Abbasid Revolution. Prince Abd al-Rahman barely, and I mean barely, escapes with his life. He spends years crossing scorching deserts, dodging assassins, and navigating the incredibly hostile, volatile political terrain of North Africa. Finally, in 755 AD, he crosses the sea into the Iberian Peninsula, known as Al-Andalus. Just 1 year later, in 756 AD, utilizing the lingering loyalty of some old Syrian troops who had previously stationed there, he miraculously defeats the local governor near Córdoba and officially establishes the independent Umayyad Emirate. But of course, the Abbasids ruling from Baghdad weren't exactly just going to let the last surviving heir of their mortal enemies walk free. They sent a whole army all the way to Spain to hunt down the usurper. In 763 AD, Abd al-Rahman didn't just defeat this invading Abbasid army. He completely destroyed it. He actually sent the Abbasid commander's head back in a box as a gruesome, unmistakable message. This crushing victory decisively severed his new Spanish emirate from the old Middle Eastern rulers. The phoenix had firmly secured his nest, and he did it in blood. Section 3. The Caliph's Professional Army, Transforming the Military in Spain. Over the next century and a half, everything completely shifts. I mean, we've moved far, far away from that early, tribal, Syrian-based army that just defended its own homeland. By the time we hit the late Córdoba Caliphate in the 10th century, the military had totally transformed into this highly professional, mercenary-heavy, and aggressively offensive machine. They went from a local militia protecting its own backyard into a vast, centralized imperial strike force that answered to absolutely no one except the caliph.
To really grasp the sheer logistical muscle of this new machine, just think about the number 4. During the reign of Caliph Elikam II, the state was capable of launching 4 major, massive military campaigns in just 4 years, between 971 and 975. And these weren't little border skirmishes, okay? We are talking about launching a massive naval deployment across the sea into North Africa, simultaneously crushing Christian kings in the mountainous north, all while fending off brutal Viking sightings on the western coast. Managing a multi-front war like that requires unimaginable wealth and just devastating organizational capacity.
But, and this is a big but, absolute power like this casts a really dark shadow. Historical records explicitly note that the army was a constant presence, providing a clear reminder of the caliphate's coercive capacity. See, this massive military apparatus wasn't just built for fighting foreign wars. It was an inescapable, suffocating presence in the daily lives of everyday citizens. The military essentially acted as a heavily armed, coercive police force. If you incurred the caliph's wrath, it was the army that kicked your door in and arrested you. The sword was fiercely pointed outward at the state's enemies, yes, for sure, but it was increasingly pointed directly inward, demanding absolute, terrified obedience from its own subjects. Which brings us to Section 4, the price of constant war, a fragile foundation of foreign mercenaries. The hidden rot inside this golden age really came down to one critical detail. Who was actually holding the weapons? The so-called invincible Andalusian army was now this complex patchwork of newly recruited Islamized Berbers shipped over from North Africa, highly trained Slavic slave soldiers known as the Sakaliba, Visigothic converts, and even paid Christian auxiliaries. The caliphs relied heavily on these diverse non-Arab factions because, well, theoretically, they were fiercely loyal only to the guy signing their paychecks. But critically, they had absolutely zero organic ties, no shared culture, and no loyalty whatsoever to the civilian society they were violently policing. Building your empire on mercenaries? Yeah, that's a fatal double-edged sword, and it quickly became a ticking time bomb for the caliphate. As the wars dragged on endlessly, the crushing economic strain of paying this massive professional army grew totally unsustainable. And even worse, intense factional hatred broke out between the Berbers, the Slavs, and the local Andalusi Arabs. Without an iron-fisted central ruler to keep them all in check, these massive, heavily armed factions with zero loyalty to the local populace simply began turning their weapons on each other.
Section 5. Civil War and Collapse. The fire finally burns out of control. The speed of this descent into chaos, this incredibly dark period known as the Fitna, it's just stunning. After centuries of building this glorious empire, it violently unravels in literally a matter of decades. In 1009, a bloody coup removes the powerful regents. By 1013, furious Berber troops actually sack the glittering capital of Córdoba itself. In 1016, another general stages a coup and publicly beheads the previous ruler. These immense military factions violently swap control of the burning throne back and forth until 1031, when the utterly exhausted citizens of Córdoba simply exile the very last caliph. The great centralized state completely shatters. So, what's left when the dust settles? Something called the Taifa. This was a fragmented mosaic of small, weekend, independent city-states and tiny emirates built right on top of the ruins of greatness. This catastrophic internal division completely stripped away all of their defensive power, slowly leaving these isolated city-states incredibly vulnerable. Ultimately, this allowed the northern Christian kingdoms to just pick them off and conquer them one by one over the coming centuries. So, what's the big takeaway from all of this? Let's bring back our shark analogy. The shark finally stopped swimming. An entire sprawling state and economy that was perfectly engineered for continuous outward military expansion eventually ate itself, the exact moment those wars turned inward. The internal factional conflicts, fundamentally and completely, outweighed their external military supremacy. It leaves us with a pretty stark historical lesson about the nature of power. If an empire is built solely by the sword, and it relies entirely on a disconnected, mercenary apparatus to maintain its control, who exactly holds the sword when the wars finally end?